Hello everyone. Good morning. I'm Benedikt Kempken from KIT. On behalf of the organizers, Wikimedia Germany, and the association behind Semantic Media Wiki, OSDA, I want to welcome you all to the 8th Semantic Media Wiki conference. It is the biggest... Thanks. It's the biggest Semantic Media Wiki conference so far. So we have 86 participants from 17 countries, including people from Japan, from the States, or I've heard even from Sri Lanka, for example. Also, we have about 50% people participating from academia and 50% people participating from industry, which is a good measure. I could thank a lot of people to make this conference possible, but I want to focus here only on two groups. First of all, I want to thank Yuri Katkov and Carsten Hoffmeier for organizing this conference. And secondly, I want to thank the sponsors to making this conference possible, which are our platinum sponsor Wikivote, gold sponsor GIl, and two silver sponsors, Hallo Welt and Energypedia. So thanks a lot. Just some background information. There's lunch break in the basement later on. The conference dinner is included in the fee, so we meet at 6:45 down in the lobby to walk there together. It's not far. And we really appreciate if you give feedback. So there is a feedback box outside in the foyer. So tomorrow at the latest, it would be nice if you could give us feedback. You have feedback sheets in your participant package. So I would like to wish you all a very good conference. And now Markus Krötsch will announce the first speaker.
Okay. Thanks, Benedikt. Okay, so it is my great pleasure this morning to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Youlanda GIl is a project leader and research professor at the Information Sciences Institute, ISI, at the University of Southern California. She has been working in semantic technologies, knowledge-based technologies, and many things that concern many of us for many years now. Played quite prominent roles there. Her main interest in research as such is knowledge capture, I gather, which includes intelligent user interfaces I've been reading, which I found very interesting because I don't see the connection to Semantic Media Wiki yet, but I hope maybe we can make it a bit more intelligent as well. On that note, I think a joint project we had in the past was Shortipedia, which won the third prize, in fact, at the Semantic Web Challenge in 2010, and in a way has been a precursor of what now is becoming Wikidata. So it was, in a sense, the first prototype system of a purely data-driven wiki application, though with a slightly different focus on it. Danny was also involved, of course, in that. Yolanda is also prominently active in the community in a number of roles. She's the chair of the ACM Special Interest Group on Artificial Intelligence. She has been leading the Provenance Working Group at W3C, which many of you will be familiar with. And she also has been a past fellow of the AAAI, I think, yes. So without using up all her speaking time, join me in welcoming Yolanda for her keynote.
Thank you, Markus. Thank you for inviting me. I've been dying to participate in a Semantic Media Wiki conference for years, and it's never at the right date, so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I've been working for some time on with scientists on helping them be more productive and represent knowledge about science. So this is the theme of my talk today. But I hope that those of you that don't work directly on science will understand the importance of using semantics and representing data and processes all together to capture complex analysis processes. And they exist in science, but also in industry, in academia, and elsewhere. We call our work organic data science, so hopefully that sounds a little bit mysterious, and by the end of the talk it will be a little bit more clear. And I want to also start by acknowledging collaborators. One of them is here, Varun Ratnakar. He's at the end of the room there. So you can ask him all the hard questions in the next couple of days. But also I collaborate with scientists that actually have a lot of great ideas about actually semantics these days. Some years ago they didn't have so many ideas about semantics. These days are really warming up to that. I want to tell you a little bit about where I come from. I come from the Information Sciences Institute. It's in Los Angeles. It's a fantastic place to live, but also to do research. And we always welcome grad students, visitors, postdocs. If you're interested in collaborating with any of us, you're always welcome. And I just wanted to mention that we have very strong research in natural language processing, machine translation, all manners of text analysis, also a lot of work and tradition over the decades on knowledge representation and reasoning, also knowledge capture, knowledge engineering. As of late, we focused a lot on geospatial reasoning, also biomedical knowledge representation, biomedical data integration. And then the last decade or so, we've grown a lot on social network analysis. So we actually have physicists in our group that do very exotic work on analyzing social networks using principles and laws of physics. So it's kind of an eclectic but very interesting group to join. And there's more than 140 of us, so it's a pretty sizable group in AI. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and my interests, what brought me to semantic wikis, and it is an interest on interactive knowledge capture. Anything that involves a user and a complex task that requires knowledge interests me. And in particular, some work that I've done in social knowledge collection, so collecting knowledge from groups of people collaboratively. I'll talk then about the need for semantics in modern science and what brings me to want to bring semantics to scientists. I'll focus in particular on a task which is scientific data curation, and this is a task of describing data sets. And then just describing how semantic wikis can help in organic data curation. Organic data science is a broader term that we use, and I'll explain what that means, but this is really the goal of the talk, to convince you that this organic data science makes sense in science. So let's start with this topic of interactive knowledge capture and social knowledge collection. Some years ago, before anybody talked much about wikis, we were working on a project to collect common sense knowledge from what we called web volunteers. So these were people that would come to our site. It was called Learner. It was part of the Open Mind project. Tim Chiklovsky, my collaborator, was the first person to do a PhD on the Open Mind project. There were others afterwards. What we were doing here is collect facts, commonly known facts about the world. So what is a newspaper? A newspaper is made of paper. You carry a newspaper. Newspaper fits in a briefcase. So that's what we called facts. So statements really about the world. We collected a ton of those from a lot of people. And what we learned from this experience is that sometimes the statements were very ambiguous. Sometimes it was hard to tell if they were true or not. We worked very hard at principles for designing the interface to capture different types of knowledge. So they could be statements about objects, statements about activities, statements about problems that you can have while you're trying to accomplish an activity, and so on. And so by designing the interface under some principles, we actually got better content out of the users. And one thing that worried us a lot was that when you asked somebody to tell you something about a newspaper, everybody told you the same 10 things. but nobody told you the perhaps less common things about newspapers. So we put a lot of work on distributing the contributor effort onto other things that don't come to mind right away. We did a lot of work on managing contributor effort. We also worked on having people create arguments collaboratively, and this is something that you see a lot on wiki frameworks, where people are studying how the arguments or the discussions in the wikis can be better structured. We did some work in that area. We also worked on having people collaborating doing tasks. So when you have a long list of to-dos, maybe one of to-dos is to sell your car, you could share that knowledge with someone in your social network that has done that task, and what are the steps that they followed and what websites they reused and so on. And as Marcus mentioned, one of the projects that we worked on, and this is more recent, is Shortypedia with Marcus and Danny and others, where we were looking at describing structured facts about a particular topic. So this is an example of Lake Baikal. This was an extension of Semantic Media Wiki, where you have a box, a table really, where you can assert properties and values. And the properties and values, actually, there can be more than one value for a property, because different sources may make a different assertion. So in this case, the area of catchment of this lake is actually different if you look in the Russian version of Wikipedia or in the English version of Wikipedia. So depending on sources, you can have different values for the same assertion. So tracking the provenance of these facts became important. And that's a flavor that you see today in Wikidata, which I will come back to in a minute. So for all these reasons, in social knowledge collection, there's a lot of research issues that we've worked on, from the way that we need to design a user interface to be proactive, to provide assistance, to guide users, to format questions so that the user knows what to contribute, to coordinate contributions, to distribute questions to the right contributors, the evaluation of the quality of the knowledge. We've also done a lot of work on that. There's many topics that are of interest in guiding users to provide knowledge in a coordinated way. And this is really what brings us to using Semantic Media Wiki, as you'll see in the talk. We'll also have a talk tomorrow on a related topic, which is to analyze. We analyze about 230 Semantic Media Wiki installations, looking at the behaviors of the communities and how they use the knowledge structures in the Semantic Wiki. Okay, so any problem, as I mentioned, that has this flavor of a group of people trying to solve a hard problem that involves knowledge is really interesting to me, and that brings me to talk about science. So let's go there. So why do we need semantics in modern science, and in what sense and to what depth do we need them? So science is getting more and more complex over time. You can read a lot of articles that talk about how science is challenging computing. It's pushing the envelope in many ways in computer, and vice versa. As we advance computing, we are able to push the envelope in science. So this symbiosis between science and computing is very true, I find. What you hear about most is the big collaborations that happen, especially in physics and astronomy and geophysics. So you've all heard of the Large Hadron Collider, probably the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, the Square Kilometer Array. There's a number of projects that typically physicists and astronomers or sometimes geophysicists organize. What they have in common is that they'll build a big shared instrument. So this is an example of on the lower left, the LIGO instrument. So they build a big instrument. The Large Hadron Collider is another example. And then lots of physicists, a big community, will share that instrument and analyze the data. So that's one flavor of modern science, where mostly you hear about the volume of the data. and the big data aspects of science that challenge computing. And this is true, and we've worked on this. This is work that we did back in 2007, where we were simulating earthquakes, and these were physics-based simulation. We generated terabytes of data per hour, and what you can see in the middle is that the process and all the knowledge that was needed to actually solve these science problems, it was not just about the volume of data, it was about synthesizing different types of data and different types of knowledge that were contained in different disciplines across sciences. So we would have these meetings that lasted months where the seismologists and people that study, for example, fault ruptures would dialogue about how their data would interact and how their models would interact. So the communication between the scientists started to be apparent already in these projects. So the size of the data is what you see most in the press and what catches your eye, but don't let it fool you. There's a tremendous amount of interaction and exchange of knowledge across disciplines that is really necessary in science. This is an example with the Large Hadron Collider. So of course, a lot of data, but as you know, both the ATLAS and the CMS experiments had thousands of scientists participating. So the ATLAS article that appeared in Science had about 2,000 authors, okay? And what I want to show you is this process that they went through. So this is a workflow that describes how their data moved through the system. And each of those red circles, you know, if the distortion is right, each of those red circles really describes a smaller group that actually collaborated and figured out how their data, their models, their perspective, and their knowledge fit together. So this synthesizing of knowledge across different areas of expertise is very important. What you see here in this example in ATLAS, but also in the earthquake simulation example, are predefined collaborations. So we agreed to build this big instrument. We agreed to build a Large Hadron Collider. We're going to ask for many millions to build it, and then we're going to share the data, and we know what we want to do with it, and we know we need to collaborate. So some idea of how this was going to work out existed. In contrast, what you see happening in science is that it's very, very, very hard to make advances where there is no predefined expectation of who needs to sit at the table and how to collaborate. So I'll give you a couple of examples of these problems. And this is what's really challenging their ability to exchange knowledge, and this is what's bringing them to wanting to represent their knowledge in some formal way online so that others can understand it. So this is an example where you want to understand climate change and climate dynamics over time, so from you know, other eras to today. So the more that you think about the problem, the more you realize how many disciplines need to be involved. So you think that there's particular scientists that worry about climate dynamics and understand models that go over very large periods of time, but actually you need to understand atmospheric models and really climate simulation models even in smaller scales. You need to understand paleoceanography because everything at some point was covered by water, and there's a lot of data that you get from things that have to do with paleoceanography, geochemistry as well, because you're really collecting samples and you want to understand what happened to them. But you start to collect samples, and many of them have to do with things that are actually understood well by marine geologists and marine geobiologists. So the more that you try to carve the problem, the more you see that there's a lot of different pieces of biology and climate research, atmospheric science, and so on that are relevant. And the more that you're able to synthesize these data and this knowledge, the more you're able to solve the hard problems in climate change. Who needs to sit at the table, and how do we bring this data and this knowledge together is really the challenge. So how can we create a framework that lets people come and understand how they can contribute and what they can contribute based on their knowledge and their experience and their models and their data? And that's the challenge that they have. imagine if you could put a big wiki in the middle. Here's another example. So understanding the age of water, how when water falls on a particular river basin, how much of it stays in the terrain, how much stays underground, how much stays on the surface, and for how long. If there's a lake or any kind of place where it can stay still, how long does it stay there? So they actually are beginning to understand how to track the age of water through isotopes. And it really requires a lot of different pieces of expertise. So people that study hydrology and the shape of river beds have a certain understanding of water dynamics. People that study vegetation have a different understanding of water. People who study the chemistry of water have yet a separate understanding of water. So again, the trick is, how do you get all of those pieces of knowledge together without really knowing ahead of time what are all the pieces that are going to help you understand the cycle of water. The spaces where you study water can actually be quite large. So if someone's collecting and understanding samples about this lake, and someone's collecting and understanding samples about the river downstream, those are two very different sources of data, and you may need to collect many of those to understand what's happening in a whole riverbed. So I hope that these examples tell you that there's some kinds of problems that are very important for us. So understanding the age of water means you understand the carbon cycle better. There's a lot of big challenging problems in science today that really require very ad hoc, dynamic, organic kinds of collaborations. And unless we open the process of doing science, unless we make it so that people can understand where they can contribute and what they can contribute, it's very hard for science to advance very easily. So scientists themselves, when they think about the future of science and the need for actually exchange of these types of data, they don't quite understand what semantics is necessarily, but they know they need something that looks like semantics. So this is a slide that I've taken from the EarthCube initiative. It's an initiative that started in the United States, but it's really inclusive and international. It's called EarthCube, for solving hard problems in geosciences. So the age of water that I mentioned, and many other hard problems, where when they think about being productive, when they think about doing integrative science, when they think about big challenges that include breaking the barriers across disciplines, they really think about semantics. This is that big S down there. So this is something developed by the scientists, acknowledging that they need better ways to convey knowledge to one another. Okay, so let me get a little bit more concrete about how these collaborations need to happen through semantics. So I want to pick a very particular problem, which is scientific data curation. And let me give you the next level down on how those collaborations can happen through semantics. So to collaborate to solve these big problems, in many cases, and in particular, ecology is a very good area to pick here. In many cases, the data is not even available or shared or even described in a way that others can know that it exists even. So what you have is a lot of scientists that actually go and do, they are very many, they're called the long tail of science, and they'll go to a particular site, a lake or a river site where they have a sensor, and then they'll collect water, and then they'll bring it to the lab, they'll analyze it, and they have data for that day. They may do this once a week for 30 years. You have a ton of data sitting on their desktops. They spend a lot of time doing quality control, preparing that data. They really have 30 years of data beautifully constructed. But very little of it is actually shared or published in any way. So how can we get that data published better? This is an example just to give you an idea of how they actually go through a lot of pain to spend a lot of money on sensors and spend a lot of time going in a river, for example, and collect data in many sites across the river if this particular person is studying a river. So what they are asked to do today is to go to sites, and this is an example of the ELTER site for data about water. So they go to these sites and they're asked to basically fill out tons of forms. And the forms include things like, you know, the lat long where the sample was collected, and your name and your last name, and the last name of your boss, and the last name of the technical person in your team, all kinds of silly things like that. And then you create an abstract where you describe the data, but it's all text, and it will say, this data set contains data about these 3 lakes, Mendota, Monona, and Wingra, and the sampling frequency is annually, et cetera, et cetera. But none of that is captured in the metadata. So when they're trying to retrieve data from any lake that has an annual sampling frequency, they can't do that. So going through the trouble of filling out these reams of metadata is not very useful because the data sets are not described in a way that lets anyone else find them or discover them. Okay? So there's little incentive for them to actually spend time describing their data. And why is it hard to create the metadata that's needed to describe and then discover this data? One is because, as I've just shown you, any repository of data that they have available for their field really requires filling in a lot of metadata. That's a lot of work, and they really don't feel very motivated to spend all that effort. Also, really, if those fields that you saw in the previous slide, if you said, well, why don't we put in there the collection frequency? Okay, so that everybody has a structured way to add the collection frequency, that triggers an entire process that could take forever, and so they don't have that kind of time, and it gets very frustrating. There's also a lot of metadata standards, and they're not always very comprehensive, they're not always very necessarily adopted, so sometimes before you can even fill in a repository, you really have to learn all these standards, and it's not a lot of fun a lot of times. In the example that I just gave you, there's some environmental metadata language that I've never heard of. So I don't know about them, but I've heard of a lot of metadata standards for ecology, but it's kind of hard because there's a lot of them. And then finally, if you try to create metadata for your data sets, it's really daunting. So if you've collected data for 30 years yourself, you really have a lot of files and data sets to organize and to publish. That can take a lot of work. But also, if you are a community, you may have been collecting samples by taking trips on a ship for a long time, for many trips, and all of those are collected, and now you have to add metadata to all of them. That's a lot of work. So sometimes the community just has IDs and they just have informal descriptions of the metadata. So an example from paleoclimate that I mentioned earlier is they have a data source that has 70,000 paleoclimate data sets, and each of them has a heading with a lot of text that describes the data set, and then the data as comma-separated values. So it really gets very daunting to try to do this. So we saw an opportunity for semantic wikis to come in and fill in this vacuum of how can you get scientists to really create their own descriptions of data and really be able to get participation from others to help describe data on the fly. There's another set of challenges, which is understanding the incentives of scientists to share data. So sometimes web volunteers, as we've seen in our previous work, they have their own motivation and their own incentives to contribute, but scientists is kind of tricky. So they will contribute if they know that their work is going to pay off. So if they believe they're contributing to a site that is going to be very hard to be discoverable, where the data is not going to be easily found by others, they won't be very excited. And the current data repositories are really very siloed. Also, if you collect data and you're going to share your data, you really feel like a second-class citizen. So someone else is going to use the data that you share. So you'd like to participate in whatever science is done with your data, if possible. And sometimes you have opinions about what the data is and represents. So you want to participate in that. And then a lot of times, the activity of sharing data is not really part of what you want to do. You want to do and analyze your data or do something else, but really sharing data is not part of science per se. So here we see a lot of opportunities to really extend semantic wikis to be inclusive of other collaborative activities that go beyond describing certain objects or describing certain items. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk on these two sets of challenges. One is creating appropriate metadata for scientific data, and the other one is creating the appropriate incentives to do this. So let me go to the first one. So when doing data curation, I mentioned that there's a lot of issues that they have with filling in predefined metadata schemas, understanding metadata standards that already exist, that are not really already adopted, they're not comprehensive, they may need new properties, it's hard to add that, and also they may have too much data to describe on their own. So our approach is to make this data curation process, this process of describing data sets, become organic and open it up to contributors of many forms. The idea is the following. If you collect data about a lake, there's a lot of local lake associations that are willing to help maintain data about that lake. There's actually a lot of different scientists that may be interested in that lake. It doesn't have to be you who are the one who maintains the sensor in the lake, who actually goes through the trouble of describing that data set to a lot of detail. So we want to be able to open the process of describing data. We want the data to be organized in an emergent way where people can describe and add their own properties. We want the providers of the data to not be the ones burdened to have to describe the data in detail. And one very important thing for scientists is to be able to expose credit. So give credit to anyone who's actually put work into describing the data. So what we do is we build on Semantic Web Standards. So this is what helps us not create silos. This is what helps us expose the data that we collect in a way that is reusable and accessible universally on the web. Also linked data principles where we are able to export the data and make it discoverable and keep it open. And finally, to have a very easy to use collaborative web platform, which is provided by Semantic Media Wiki, which allows users to define their own properties. So I'll show you some examples of how we do this. This is a data set from paleoclimatology. We create a special type of page, a special category of page, which is data. It has to have a download site where they can actually find the data. And then they create a bunch of properties and values for this particular data set. So that starts to describe what the data set is about. In this case, this is a sample that was taken from a lake that is now dry. If I'm adding a new data set and I'm describing now a data set that has coral, coral actually has a genus and species and actually can have 2 different species of coral in the same sample. I don't have to ask permission from anybody to add these things. This excites them no end. When they see this, they say, so I just want to put a new property and I can just do it? So this is really exciting for them. The next thing that we do is that as you're adding a new property, they start typing the name of the property they want to create. And we just do, at the moment, simple string matching. We offer them completions of that property based on properties that others have defined. Sometimes they look at data sets that are similar, but sometimes they'll just look at these completions and adopt them if they're appropriate. So this is also something that they like because they can normalize the creation of new properties and reuse them if they'd like to. And then anything that is a standard that is already incorporated in the wiki, they can reuse. The contributions are and credit are very important, so we've extended Semantic Media Wiki to actually track every assertion that every contributor makes, and so we actually display them prominently in the wiki at the bottom of every page, but also in the front of the wiki, who are the highest contributors and such. This is very important for them, especially because a lot of this work is often done by students that don't always get the credit that they deserve. So for them to be able to say, I really contributed a lot to describing these kinds of data sets. In the end, all of these paleoclimatology data sets, they have 70,000 of these, okay? And in the end, if they're describing coral, now you have to go and describe coral, right? So now they're thinking, well, we should really work very closely with marine biologists that actually understand different species of coral. Maybe they should have a wiki like ours to create this. So they're really starting to think about a very connected set of wiki entries that really don't have any barriers or distinctions between the different topics and the different kinds of data. So they're thinking about creating wikis that describe paleoclimatology data sets. If they refer to corals, there can be pointers to other wikis, other pages, other sites that may have descriptions of coral. Maybe it is the same wiki. They don't know yet if they want to keep all of these separate or together. And then if this is collected at a certain site, in this case Palmyra, maybe Wikidata will have a good description of that particular Palmyra atoll where the sample was collected, and they'll just point to that. They also really love the ability to create dynamic content and expose missing knowledge by doing this. So being able to expose that, if I make this query, there's a table popping up that shows that one of the data sets is missing the measurement units, for example, as well. Okay, so we're really turning the traditional data curation, which, as I mentioned, is really painful. All the schemas are predefined. It's really hard to add a new property if one needs one. It's really hard to create metadata for existing data sets all by yourself or for 70,000 data sets. So now they're seeing this path of organic data curation where they're opening up the process. They're going to want to say anyone who needs coral data sets and is going to use them in their research, they can spend some time in this wiki, and instead of making notes in their notepad or in their text editor, in their lab notebook, they can actually put it in the wiki, and all of those descriptions will be usable by others. And the more that you do this, the more others will be able to understand that data and reuse it. And how do we turn 70,000 data sets into a structured repository in a semantic wiki? Well, we recruit web volunteers. We'll really look for citizen scientists and others interested in helping us with this science to contribute properties and help us structure the data sets. To build this wiki, we did a number of extensions to the Semantic Media Wiki platform, so creating special pages with a special status about data, so they point to the sources for raw data. They also have structured properties in that kind of table form that I showed you. So it's nice to have text in the wiki, but they also like this table of properties. And then when asserting a property, we offer completions based on properties that are already in the system. And then we really track all the credit and display it prominently in the wiki. So these are key aspects of a semantic data curation wiki for scientists. And then lots of other extensions are needed. They really want quality ratings on the data sets. They want to know who's using them and how much they like them. They also need a lot of spatial and temporal reasoning to be included. They want to be able to track the pages and the topics that they care about. They want a personalized point of entry to the wiki. Lots of different pieces, bots that help them actually suggest clusters of data. So if the following data sets have common properties, maybe there's a class of data set that I'd like to know about that share those properties. Flagging contents that are not used, data sets that are not very well described, and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of more work to do. This is a slide from them, and this is their vision. They see a semantic core, a wiki user interface, and then extensions to this wiki that I just described that really give them the capabilities that they need. And they really see this as a way to integrate different kinds of data from different disciplines. I'm going to spend a little bit talking about, a little bit of time talking about these other challenges that I mentioned, finding the appropriate incentives for scientists to contribute. So I've been talking about just giving them the framework to be able to describe data sets. But if you think about it, describing data is not a labor of science. You don't get a paper just from describing data, right? So they really want to move towards a framework where if you share data, it's because you're going to be doing science with that data. And data sharing and data descriptions, data curation is really part of doing science in the same process. So this is really an opportunity to grow semantic wikis beyond just describing objects, just beyond describing data sets for science. So we're working on this to investigate the age of water. I'll show you examples of this in a minute. But we really want to reflect if a data set is collected, it's because a model is going to be run. It's because some visualization is going to be created. It's because that data set is going to be integrated with something else in the process. To solve the age of water, you really need to synthesize a lot of knowledge and to create a very complex process of interaction and collaboration between scientists of different disciplines. And our inspiration here is this wiki called Polymath. How many of you have heard of Polymath? The Polymath Wiki. One. Okay. So the Polymath Wiki is a wiki where professional mathematicians and citizen scientists actually collaborate to solve math problems. So you post a particular theorem that you want to prove or that you want the community to prove, and everybody can suggest the compositions of that theorem. They can provide hints for how to prove a certain aspect of that theorem, or they can decompose it into claims, or they can provide a proof to a claim or a comment on somebody else's contribution. So this is a wiki framework where this kind of collaboration to solve these complex tasks, which is proving math theorems, is done. So our view on organic data science is really to bring that flavor of collaborative problem solving to the process of science. So posing science questions, a particular category of wiki page is actually posing a question, decomposing it into sub-questions. They can have all kinds of documentation for that, all kinds of references, all kinds of discussion in the discussion page, and then the credits at the bottom. These questions need to be decomposed, and eventually they map into physical models to be run and what kind of data those models need. The models can be described in a semantic wiki. There's actually a semantic media wiki installation called CSDMS that describes models, if you can believe that. And they can be described in terms of what kind of data they required and what they produced. And eventually, the data that they require can be described, as I mentioned earlier, with structured properties and so on. We've also incorporated the ability to import workflows into the Semantic Media Wiki. There's actually a demo that we're giving here if you're interested in that aspect of it. But workflows really reflect computational processes, so not everything is human discussion and trying to elaborate a question into smaller questions, but at some point they'll need to run the code that does the simulation and generate the new data and the results, which is a particular kind of workflow. So organic data science is really supported by a wiki that exposes the science process and exposes how different questions are being elaborated and how eventually that turns into describing data sets. Each of the pages of the wiki can be of many different types. They can describe a person, a scientist, and then all the data that they've contributed, maybe all the expertise they have, and so on. They can describe a lake, they can describe a model, they can describe a workflow, or just simply a question that they're still thinking about. Doing this required a lot of extensions to the Semantic Media Wiki platform. So, as I mentioned, creating special pages, special categories for questions, for workflows, and again, tracking all the credit. And right now we're trying to understand really how to track processes and how to bring people's attention to particular processes where they can contribute, to particular tasks or questions where they can contribute. You've seen some semantic wikis in science. I just wanted to touch on this. So CSDMS I just mentioned, they actually have a lot of science models, physical models that simulate Earth dynamics and so on. So they describe the inputs and outputs of those models. GeneWiki Plus is interesting. It's simply a bot that reads content out of Wikipedia and into GeneWiki Plus, which is a semantic media wiki, so you can do structured queries with the content, but the contributors don't edit GeneWiki Plus directly. And it's really focused on particular genes, not data sets and not processes. NeuralX is really focused on all kinds of mental processes and experimental tasks that you give subjects and all kinds of neuroscience knowledge. They're putting a lot of work on connecting it to the literature and to other neuroscience resources to make it really useful, so it doesn't become its own silo. But it doesn't really capture science research or science processes the way I've described them. And then this is another example, the Red Observatory, and this is built on OntoWiki, not Semantic Media Wiki, but just to show you that there's examples of semantic wikis in science all throughout, and they all have very many different flavors. So this organic data science wiki is going to be growing in the next few months. Anyone here or there who is interested, we'd be very happy to collaborate. We're really trying to understand the incentives of scientists, the conventions that they need to use to push the processes along, how to integrate their face-to-face interactions and meetings with driving this wiki, how to engage contributors from other communities. So this is going to be a really exciting project moving forward. When you open science in this way, you really open science to citizens to participate. So as you know, there's many installations of semantic wikis and semantic media wiki where people are contributing all kinds of knowledge about beaches and water quality. Maybe that's relevant to these researchers, and maybe they'll create new ones if the scientists are paying attention. And as I said, this is scientists talking about their need for semantics. A lot of the ideas in this talk have really not come from me, but they've come from them. How could we do X? And I think that what we found in extending Semantic Media Wiki has been a very promising way to address their questions. And then if you're interested in science and exposing science processes and intelligent systems to assist scientists, there's an upcoming AAAI Fall Symposium and an entire initiative on discovery informatics that you'll find very interesting. And I just want to thank you for listening and hope you'll be interested in these topics and talk to me if you are.
Wow, thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. I could ask many questions, wouldn't know where to start. But maybe someone of you already has their own. If I get a microphone working, maybe we can even record them. Oh, now it's on. Ah. Good morning. So I'll just carry this around. Don't speak too close to the microphone.
Hi. How do you deal with conflicting ontologies?
They expect that there will be a lot of them, and they expect that they will need a lot of committees to resolve those. So they are convinced that the kinds of editorial processes that are often combined with wikis, not just Semantic Media Wiki, but with wikis, they fully expect that these editorial processes will have to be developed. They have no idea what they should look like and what's going to work for them, but they do expect that those will arise. It's very interesting because it's not a topic that we often talk about. The combination of social conventions and social processes and technological or web infrastructure. But I think that this is something that they're very sensitive to.
Yeah, I was wondering to what extent you are including the actual data into the wiki or just describing it in a metadata way. And if you include the data, or if you describe it, how do you connect the raw data? Like, how do you describe where to find that data technically and so on?
This is a fantastic question. So, when you ask this question of the scientists, right, they'll tell you, no, we want the data here. And yeah, we want the data here. But in fact, then their colleagues are the ones that work for the government and have been maintaining those 70,000 data sets for years. And those colleagues will tell them, oh, how are you going to deal with inconsistencies? How are you going to deal with updates to the data over time? How are you going to deal with someone requesting, doing queries of the data set of this form of the other? And so they start to realize that maybe managing the data is a separate task from managing the metadata and the knowledge. But also, they would like to be able to do geospatial queries or be in front of some map and be able to select pieces and so on. So it's very unclear how much of the data management itself they would like to have included in the wiki. So the paleoclimatology guys really want the data in the wiki. They really want it to be in the same site. And they want to live it with the metadata and not be separate and be managed by the same community and processes. But I don't think that's always going to be possible. And then, of course, there's the issue of the size of the data. So many times these data sets are really, on the order of petabytes. So you just can't do that. So traditionally, scientific data sets are, the data and the metadata are separate entities. So we're just going to live with providing URIs to the data sets. They're often available through URIs, but the problem's going to come in the ways that they want to aggregate and slice the data, which are always problematic.
Yeah, hello. Did you manage by any chance to have scientists co-construct knowledge in a wiki? Because in my experience it's very difficult, because scientists, they do understand their tools of trade with respect to data analysis, but besides that, they only know about how to use a word processor, and they do not understand wikis, hypertext, and that kind of stuff. Or do you have a positive experience somewhere?
This is a very good question. What do you think I'm going to answer to this? So the answer to this is I spend a lot more time at meetings with scientists than I do at meetings with computer scientists. And I would say of every 100 scientists that I meet, that I interact with in some way, they give a talk or I meet them in the hallway and so on, of every 100, I would say about 10 really understand what I'm talking about. So on this EarthCube initiative, I've been talking about intelligent systems and semantics for 2 years. And in the last big meeting that we had was in August. Somebody in a panel said, you know, the thing that we really need, you know, forget about data management. The thing we really need is systems that have telepathy, that understand my data, that I can ask good questions from, that, you know, really can answer, you know, questions that have meat in them, right? And I said, telepathy, that's the word I need to be using, right? So of 100 scientists that I meet, maybe 10 get what all this stuff is about and they get excited about it. And then really 5 can really do it. They tend to be the younger guys. They tend to be the guys that understand Wikipedia and really have, you know, grown up with wikis. And they also appreciate the difficulties that come with this, but you know, really a small size. But I will tell you, in biomedical, in the biomedical area, it took one guy to build the first draft of the gene ontology. It took him 6 months and a lot of heartache. He very carefully set the tone, and then everything followed. So I'm really a firm believer that even out of 100 scientists that I meet, only 5 really get it, and maybe only 1 wants to get it going, then I think it's going to happen.
Just a side note, coming out of the community, it also took the Human Genome Project to really drive people to use the gene ontology. It was not that people magically just said, cool, let's use that tool, but that they were actually driven by need to collaborate globally to actually start using tools, and it's not just create another, you know, data silo here, another one over there. So there's also something that the moment tools available, people have to realize, how do you use it and what do we use it for? So that's, I mean, a whole other challenge of saying, great, we have tools. Now what do we do with them?
Yeah. In that case, the goal of the gene ontology was very clear. I think in the case of the paleoclimatology data sets, very clear. They want to describe these 70,000 data sets. We're going to do wonderful things if we're able to do this, right? It's a very concrete goal. Same thing with the age of water. It's clear what the science question is, and there's already dozens of people paying attention to that because it's such a great question, and they each can only see their part of the elephant.
Okay, if there's no further questions for now, I think we can discuss many things over the coffee break. Thanks again for this very nice talk, Yolanda.